Welcome to Lesson 14 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to finish working on the Create Team form. So far, we've wired everything on the Create Team up except for the button that actually creates the team. So in this video, we're going to change that. Let's get started. Now we have to figure out first what this button should do. We have a team name, we have the people on the team. Sometimes I find it helpful to go back to the database where we've designed things out and see where this is going to live so we can kind of help see what our ideas were when we built this thing out. So we have here teams. Let's design this. It has just really two things, an ID and a team name. And then you have team members. And that has the row ID, the team ID, and the person ID. And that's it. So we have two tables to fill in. First one is teams, and the second one is team members. And that order is important because in this one, when we create a record, we'll get this ID back. We'll use that ID right here when we also add each person. So it's going to be a two-step process. And the first thing you need to do is create our store procedures. We have the team get by tournament, but we don't have any inserts for the team or the team members. So let's create those. New store procedure. We'll delete out all of this. Again, I would leave this and actually fill it in if you're actually creating these store procedures. And the format is SP Teams Insert. Now, what do we need to know for creating a team? Well, we need the @team name. And if we look at the teams here, the columns, we can see team name is an nvarchar 100. So that's all that's coming in, but then I'm going to have this @id int equals 0 output. And that'll be the ID going the other direction. We'll leave the no count in, but take out the comments. And we're going to say insert into dbo.teams team name values @team name. And then select @id equals scope identity. And that's it. So we have our team name being passed in, and then we're pulling back that ID as an output, and that's we capture here, just like before. So you run this, and while we're here, let's also create the team members insert. So let's expand this out, and I'll create a new store procedure. The temptation here is to copy this and just modify it for what we need. But I'd recommend against that because, again, just like copying and select @id equals scope identity, and we're good to go. So we'll run that, make sure it runs. We will refresh down here just to make sure those two do pop up in the list. So there is the team members insert, and there's the teams insert. So both of those are working, or at least they should. Let's come back over to here and double click on this button to create the event. So now we have the event, and what should we do here? And the decision here is, do we call two different methods, or do we call one method and have it do both jobs? So we have two different things going on. We have the team name being sent, and ID gets passed back. Then we send the list of IDs from here, and also the ID from the team, and then we have our team members list. So is that two actions or one? Now we have the idea of the single responsibility principle from the SOLID acronym. And the idea there is that each method does one thing. But the question is this one thing or two? Now I'm going to argue this is one transaction. You can decide, nope, I want to do two different ones. But here's why I'd argue it's one transaction. Because you're creating the entire team. Both the name and the members are one set of data. They go to two different tables, and it'll be two different insert statements, but it's one set. Therefore, I like the idea of doing them together so we don't do half the job and then fail and not do the other half. So let's start at the iData connector, or connection. And we have here our create prize, create person, and now we need some type of create team. And if we look at our team model, we see we have a list of person model and a team name. So that's perfect. So we're going to say, let's put it up here. Doesn't matter where you put in the list. Team model, we'll return the whole model all over again. Create team. Team model. So we're going to pass in a team model, just like we do it with prize or with person. It's just a little more complex. And we're going to get back a team model because we're going to pass back in that ID. But if you notice over here, there is no ID. So let's add that. And also this ordering is bugging me. I'm not sure why you ordered it that way. I'm going to switch those around so that team name's above the members. All right, so just like with prize model, we have the ID. With team member, we have the ID, which also makes me think, do we have ID in person model? And I believe we do, but let's just check. Yes, we do. So we have all the IDs we need to be passing back and forth. So now we have this create team part of the contract, our iData connection contract, our interface. And so now each of these two connectors, SQL connector, and the text connector, they both need to implement that interface. So let's do that. Let's go into both and make sure that they both implement. Control dot and enter. And that just creates our public method with the throw new not implemented exception. That's fine. We'll come back to text in a minute. Let's start with SQL. So here we have our SQL where it says, okay, you want to create a team? Great, go for it. So let's start with a using. And in fact, we can copy and paste this using statement because it's really the same thing. Oops, let's not copy a query. Let's copy and execute instead. because it has the way we're going to do executions. So let's copy this and paste it right here. So we're actually going to do two different inserts. The first one takes in the team name, and the only other thing it takes in is actually an output, and that's the ID. So team name, we're going to say model dot team name. Since we copy and pasted, we have to be very careful to check everything. So let's go through, make sure we have our database is correct. It is. Then we have our team name, our ID. It's an output. We come down here. This is not correct. And come back over here to our SQL. I'm going to copy that and paste in right there. So we have the correct value or the correct name for our store procedure. We do have a model.id, and that is the team ID, so that's perfect. But before we return the model, we have to do some more work. What we need to do is we need to insert every one of those people into our table. If we come back over here to our SQL, and look, we take in one person. So this team members table is going to have a number of rows per team, one for every team member. And doing that is fairly simple. We just need to do a loop. In this case, a for each. For each person model P in model dot team members. So we'll loop through this. Oh, we already have a P. We'll say TM for team member. All right, so for each one of these, we have to do a new insert. Let's copy this. Paste it in there. All right, so instead of SP teams, it's team members insert. So we'll change that store procedure. And this is a tricky bit here. We already have a P, but it's a dynamic parameters, which we want to use. Therefore, we can just change it to not say var in front of it. And now we're just going to overwrite that P every time, which is great. It's what we want. Now let's grab our parameters. So you have team ID and person ID. So at team ID, and that's model.id. And then we have the same for each one of them. We're not actually going to need to grab the ID coming back out because we don't need it in any way. So we can ignore that and instead do the at person ID equals, and it's not model because it's per person model, so we want to say tm.id. And this should already be filled in because these people are already in our database, and so we have IDs for all of them. Even if we add a new person, we first get the ID back after saving them, and then put them in our list. So we always have IDs for all of our people that we're adding to a team. So that's all there should be for the create team portion for SQL. So we'll ignore text for now. And we'll come back over to our form and the code behind. All right, so in here, first we want to create our team member object. So team model T equals new team model. T.team name, oops, not members, name, equals, We had to grab whatever the name of this is. It's team name value. So team name value dot text, and then the t dot team members equals, and that's just our list up here of selected team members. And notice it's a list of person model, and this is a list of person model. So that works fine. And now we say global config dot connection dot create team, pass in t. We can say t equals, just to capture it back out. And now we're done. Now the team has been created, and really this form should close, because we're not going to leave this open to create a new team. We're going to go back to our other form that called this, most likely. But just to be on the safe side, what we can do is we can reset up all of this information. So let's create a note to just remind ourselves, hey, if you're not going to close out this form, reset it. So let's do that over here. So we're going to say to do, if we aren't closing this form after creation, reset the form. So I'm not quite sure how we're going to use this form yet. We haven't really talked about how these forms all interact, but I think that we're going to drive everything off of the create tournament form. And so it'll create a team, it'll come back, it'll add that team, and then it'll say, oh, I want to create another team, and do the same thing over and over again. So in that case, we can just close out the form, because that will wipe everything out. There's no reason to set everything back up new. So we'll leave it like that for now. And the only other thing we need to do for testing purposes is make sure we change this back to SQL. And now let's run this. Before we get too far though, I want to look at both the team table and the team members table. I'll run both of those, and they are both blank. So that's this place to start. Now let's run this and call it this first team. Let's call it team first place. I'm going to add Tim and Sue to this team, just so we have two. And then I'll say create team. Now remember, we didn't wipe anything out, because we're going to assume that this form will close when we hit that create team. But let's go over our SQL and run this again. And we can see that I have the team first place down here. We can zoom in here. There's team first place, an ID of 1. And then we have two people, both on the team ID of 1. The first person is 1, the second person is 2. I would assume that that person 1 is Tim and person 2 is Sue. Now we could look that up if we wanted to. That's not hard. We could say select star from dbo.people, where or ID, sorry. ID in 1, 2. And that just says, give me all the people that have an ID of 1 or 2. And that'd be Tim and Sue. So, yep, that all seems to work just fine. So now let's wire up our text side. So let's first change this over to text, which right now will throw an error which is great because then if we were to do this accidentally, we hadn't set it up yet, notice different people because we're in text now. We create team, it's going to throw that new not implemented exception, which is great. So let's go ahead and implement this method right here. Now again, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. So let's look at what I did in other areas. For example, here, I first load all of the prize model in, and then I find the max ID. I go up one, I add the prize. If we look at that, we have an ID, great. We have a team name, great. And we have a list of person model. We don't have a separate model for these people. And by that I mean, if you go to the database and look at team members, there's the team ID, the person ID, and the ID of the row that they're entered in. We don't have that reflected in this model. And that's okay. We don't need to have that information. In fact, it's kind of worthless. Instead, we like to have the person model, which has their name and their email address and their cell phone number and all the rest. So we don't need to have two different text files. Instead, we need to have one text file that just handles the idea of we can say, let's get a list of team model, call it teams equals, there's our file name, dot full file path, dot load file, dot convert to team model, plural. Models. We don't have that yet. So we need to create that. So let's do that. Let's put it in the same spot as this convert to prize models. And it's okay that it's yelling at me right now. I kind of want that because I know I'm not done there yet. So we have these two converts, convert to prize model, convert to person model. So let's create another one. Public static list of team model, convert to team models. This list of string, and we'll say lines. Okay. So what exactly does the text file look like? Remember, it's a comma separated list, so we probably have ID, comma, team name, comma, and that's where it gets kind of tricky. Because if we look at the team model, it's a list of person, which doesn't make sense to say the whole person. That's kind of duplicating information. So instead, what if we have a set of values that's separated? Now, normally it would be a comma separated list, but because this is a CSV file where it's already comma separated, let's do something else. So let's take the list of IDs separated by the pipe. That's going to look like, let's say 3 comma Tim's team comma 1 pipe 3 pipe 5. So that's what a row would look like. And so this represents the ID of a team, the name of the team, and then each ID of each person. Now we're not done there because we're going to have to rehydrate that. We're going to have to pull those people out and say, okay, we have these IDs. What's the full model for that person? So we have to do some other calls here to pull in our list of people. And so we'll do that at some point. But first, let's get this part of it done. So we're going to do a for each. Let's create a list first, List of team model output equals new list of team model. We're going to do a for each string line in lines. And we'll say string array calls equals line dot split. Single quotes around a comma. Notice I'm just following the same pattern I have up here. And so now we have a team model. T equals new team model. T.id equals calls 0. T.team name, team name equals calls 1. And don't forget to wrap this one with a int.parse. And now we have to deal with that pesky last column, which is our list of IDs for people. So what are we going to do about that? Well, let's go back and look at our text connector real quick and look at the create person here. The first thing we do is we pull in the people file and convert it to a list of person or person model. That would get us every person that we have saved in our text file, which would give us something to look up then by ID. Come back over here and say comma string people file name. And now it's getting unbroken, at least as far as passing in information. Now, why is there only one parameter again? Again, this is because the first parameter is actually the output of this right here. And you can tell that because it says this in front of it. And that's the extension method, how it works. So the second parameter becomes the first visible one you see inside those parens. And that's the people file name. So up here, right after I do my output, I'm going to paste in that line. And then I'm going to change the file name to the passed in file name, people file name. And now I have a list of people. So now I can say string array. We're going to say person. Wow, there we go. IDs equals calls to dot split single quotes pipe character. So what does that do? It takes the third column, calls number 2, since 0, 1, 2, takes the third column, splits it by the pipe character, and puts that into an array called person IDs. Now comes the tricky part. How are we going to deal with looking up these people IDs? Not because looking up the IDs is hard. It's because what happens if we have an ID that isn't in our list of people? That could be a problem. Okay? So we have a couple options. One, we could gracefully skip over that person. Or 2, we can blow up. I think for right now, we're actually going to blow up. Because again, that application in an uncertain state or a half-done state isn't what we wanted. So if the first record succeeds and the second record we can't find the person, that doesn't mean the team should have one less person on the team. It means we've got an error in our list somewhere. But in this case, we're going to blow up, and that way we know, nope, that didn't work. So for each string ID in person IDs, and we're going to say like so, and that should do it. Now there's a lot of parentheses in there, and a lot of stuff going on, so let's break this down a little bit. So this right here, what it's doing is saying take the list of people, all the people in our text file, and says search for it and filter where the ID of the person in the list equals the ID from right here. So in theory, it should find only one person. We're doing a parse int on a string. Don't forget that. Otherwise, there's a string compared to an int, and that won't work. So the theory is each ID is unique, and therefore we should never have more than one. But C# doesn't know that. And so it says, I'm returning a list. And so we say, give us your first item. Now, if you did return 3 items in this list, it would still only give you the first one. But since we know it should be a one-to-one relationship, then the first one is the only one. Now, here's where it's going to blow up on this first. If there's 0 on the list, it's going to say, I can't do that, and it's going to explode. There is an option here, first or default. And what that will do is it will return null if it can't find a record instead of blowing up. But again, that wouldn't crash our application. Therefore, we could conceivably think that this is working when in fact it's not. So we're going to leave it like that. It's going to find the person object and add it to the team members list of object. So all that to say, for each line in our text file, add the ID and the team name, and then loop through and add the team members based upon splitting out calls to, which is this value right here, splitting this out by the pipe, and therefore we know which IDs, which we can then look up in our people list to find the full person object to add to our team members list. With all of that being done, we can return output. And now convert to team models is complete. If we come back over here, no more yelling at us. In theory, we have a list of team model called teams. Now we need to follow the same pattern as up here, where we get the ID. And in fact, let's just copy this and paste it. Current ID and teams.count is greater than 0. Teams order by descending by the ID, which is the same name as we give it for every one of them. So that's fine. Find the first, find the ID, add 1. That's our new current ID. Put that current ID in the ID area for our team. And then we're going to say teams.add file, save to people file, and now we will have public static void save to team file. This list of team models string file name. First, we're going to create that list of string. And that'll be what we save at the end. Then we're going to do our for each and say team model t in models. And we're going to say we need to add a line for each one of them. But before we do, we have to address that list in there that we have to convert over to our pipe delimited set. So how are we going to do that? Well, we probably need to have another for each, but it seems like that's doing too much in this for each loop. So let's create another helper method. Let's create a private static, and we have return type of string. That's what we want. And let's call it convert people list to string. Let's pass in a list of person model and call it people. So this method's job is to take that list of person model and return a string instead. That way up here, we can just do the same kind of thing, only instead of passing in just the value for that last one, we will pass that value to this method and use the returning string in this place. So it's a little complicated to kind of visualize if you're not seeing it at first, But that's okay. We're going to do it here. You'll see it, and then I think the light bulb will click on. You'll go, oh, okay, I know what I'm doing. So let's start with what we need. We need a string output equals an empty string. And the last thing we'll do is return that output. Before we do, we're going to do a for each person model p in people. And we're going to say output plus equals p.id. And in fact, let's do this as our special string here with a $sign in front of it. That way we can do the pipe right in line. So for each person in the people list, we're going to say add to the output this. First the ID, which will get converted to a string, and then the pipe character. So everyone's going to have that. So after the first entry, say the first entry is 2, it's going to look like this. After the second entry, say it's 5, it'll look like this. Now, before you jump the gun and say, okay, we're done, at the very end, the last thing we need to do is take off this, the trailing pipe character. And the way to do this is fairly simple. We're just going to say output equals output, if I can spell, dot substring, start at position 0, and go to output dot length minus 1. And finally, return output. So what's going to happen is, after we loop through, we're going to have something that looks like this. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to do a substring of our output. And what substring does is it takes a piece of our string and returns that value. We're going to start at position 0. Each character is one number. Starting at 0, it's a 0-based array. And so I said start at 0 and count this many characters. Well, the length, which would be all the characters, minus 1. And that starts at position 0, that's right here, then 1, then 2, and it says, well, I had a length of 3, so I stop at, 4, so I stop at position 3, right there, and therefore we're done. So 0-based arrays and with 1-based counts and all the rest can get very confusing. My encouragement to you is if you're not absolutely certain, what I would do is create a little test project that just does one thing. It is a very simple version of this. In fact, I did that just to double check to make sure this is the way it's supposed to work, because I always seem to get it wrong, except when I don't, and then I question myself. So just test this out in a simple fashion in a test project just to make sure that you have your counting correct, especially if you're doing things where you're counting only a certain number of characters, or you're going from the middle, or something weird like that where you of output, which starts off as an empty string, so count of 0. So So it says 0 to output length, that's 0 minus 1. Substring of 0 to minus 1, that's going to crash. So there's a few ways to handle this, but probably the easiest way is to come right up near the top and say if count equals 0, return empty string. And so what that does is it kind of short circuits this process. If there's no people in the list, there's no reason for us to loop through a list or to do the substring and all the rest. Just say if it's the count 0, return empty string, because that's what it would be. So that solves this method right here. So now, just like in here, we can say lines.add. We can do our $sign and the 2 double quotes, and semicolon at the end, and come back. We can start off with our t.id, and then our curly brace, comma, no space, curly brace, team name, curly brace, comma, another curly brace with no space. And then we're going to say convert people list to string and pass in t.team members. Then close that curly brace out. Now, this method, passing in a list of people, gets back a string of these pipe delimited items. That's going to put it in this spot right here. And so our end result is something that looks like this, which is exactly what we wanted. So the only thing left to do is to do our file.writeAllLines. And this is a baked into C# method, this file.writeAllLines. It takes in a file name, actually a file full path. So we'll give it the full path, and then an array of lines, or a list of lines. And that's our list of lines. So we've now saved to the team. The ID of 1, second is best, and then that pipe delimited list of IDs for the people. So life is good. It seems to work. And with that, we have completed the create team form. At the beginning, it seemed a little intimidating with all this stuff going on, but we broke it down into sections. This section here, this section here, this section here, then this, and then finally the create team button. So by breaking it down into little chunks, sure, it took us a little bit, but we got the job done, and it wasn't that overwhelming. Once we started getting rolling in our system and the way we're going to do things, it really was just follow the pattern and do the same thing over again and make small little decisions, not big ones. Now that we've handled this form, in our next video, we're going to tackle something a little bigger. We're going to get to the create tournament form. This is the big one, because once we have this done, then our system is pretty close to complete. The only thing we'll have left after that is to load which tournaments we have so we can view them and the actual viewer. And those are kind of small. So stick with it. We're getting close. Let's finish strong, get this application at least up and running. And then we're going to come back through and make some improvements and kind of upgrade this with a couple different fun features that really make the application stand out and be more intuitive. So stick around for that.